Welcome to everyone who is on this event today. This is a session of the Global Solutions that's focused on the global recovery, equity and inclusion, and the critical drivers for inclusive growth and sustainable development. And of course, we're really going to be looking at the issues from the perspective of gender equality and women's economic empowerment, recognizing the importance for taking into account from the beginning the needs and the important contributions, not just of women and girls, but of all vulnerable groups. As I mentioned, my name is Margo Thomas. I am the president and CEO of the Women's Economic Imperative. And I'm delighted to have this esteemed panel with us today to help us to delve into some of these issues and hopefully to focus on actions and recommendations that can help to effect change. In terms of framing the discussion, I'm going to go to two quotations that I think help us to put our heads around the challenge that we're facing and why, in our view, this is an important topic. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, said in 2020, inequality works against human development for everyone. We all suffer its consequences. And I think that in light of the pandemic, we can see clearly why the concept of mutual vulnerabilities is so important and why we need to ensure that everyone is protected in the interests of all of us. Mr. Guterres went on to say at the Think 20 summit last year that strong action at the national and global scale based firmly on human rights to tackle inequality and rebuild trust is necessary. And therefore, he said, we need a renewed social contract. On the other end of the scale, I'm going to quote from Professor Esther Duflo, Nobel laureate. She said in one of her writings, the problems facing the rich countries in the world were actually often eerily familiar to those who are used to studying the developing world. People left behind by development, ballooning inequality, lack of faith in government, fractured societies. What I take away from Professor Duflo is the point that I try to make all the time. This is not a problem or the issues that we're trying to address. It's not a global South issue. It's not the haves and the have-nots. This is a global issue and it's affecting us all. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our keynote speaker, Ms. Mitali Nikore, founder of Nikore Associates India, that is described in the literature as a youth-led think tank. And it gives me hope that the next generation is fully capable and eager to take the charge. So with that, Mitali Nikore, please.
Thank you, Margo, for inviting me here. I'm absolutely honored and humbled to be giving the keynote address today at this important gathering where all of us are here to brainstorm gender equality. I know that, having a panel on gender equality dedicated to gender is not a novel experience for, a global summit. But what I'm going to try and do in the next 5 minutes is try to give us some new frameworks to think about the issue of gender inequalities, something that maybe we have not thought through before. The first piece of data that I'd like to use to make this argument is actually a piece of data we're all very familiar with. In the year 2020, when the World Economic Forum came out with its Global Gender Gap Report, it said that it will take 100 years to reach gender equality. But just 1 year later, when it came out with the 2021 report, this number had gone up to 136. So in just 1 year of the pandemic, we had gone from 100 years to gender equality to 136 years to gender equality. And for me, this one number connotes why the time is now to act for gender equality. But it's not only a rights issue. Gender equality is not only an issue of fairness, but it's an issue of missed opportunities. And over the last few years, we have seen this consistently in report after report that gender equality can actually take us to a point of economic opportunities. One number I'd like to cite is from a McKinsey study, which actually estimates that bringing in women in the same proportion as men into the labor force can actually increase $28 trillion to our global GDP. And of course, this would disproportionately benefit the global south. But these opportunities are not being capitalized. And today, post-COVID, we're at a point in society where women's progress is being threatened. And today, I'd like to lay out 4 specific threats that are actually paramount across the world, threatening women's progress. The first one is around the loss or the lack of economic power. There are several aspects to economic power. The first one is, of course, the disproportionate participation of women in the labor force. When we look at global numbers, the female labor force participation rate stands at about 47% versus 72% for men. In countries like India, we have seen that only 30% of women overall are participating in the workforce. And this number has been low and reducing ever since independence over the last 7 decades. So this is one of the first barriers to women actually acquiring economic power. Even when women are working, they are concentrated in low paying, low productivity, low growth jobs, which are not in the STEM sector. But it's not only about work, it's also about wealth and inequalities. We know from recent reports by Oxfam that about 100 men own as much wealth as 1 billion women in Latin America. And how are we comfortable with these income inequalities? This is now unacceptable. Even when it comes to asset ownership, women own only about 20% of agricultural land globally, and it's much, much lower in countries in the global south, such as India, such as Pakistan, where women rely on agriculture for their livelihoods, but they don't own those assets. And this automatically places them at a point where they lack the power and agency for their own decision making. And this has only become worse during COVID, where we've seen that overall nearly 64 million women lost jobs in 2020. Now, when we go to the second threat, the second threat is something which terrifies me personally because I've actually spoken to women and seen how they've been affected by that, which is the gender digital divide. And we don't talk about this enough. But the fact remains that even today, only 41% of women globally in the global south have access to mobile phones and the internet. And today we're seeing that the actual progress in the world, in the economy, is being driven by the digital economy, not the physical economy. This transition has only exponentially increased during COVID, and women are being written out of that story. If women are not able to access mobile phones, understand the buttons on a mobile phone, how can they pivot to digital marketplaces? How can they participate in online learning? This gender-based digital divide threatens to take away a lot of progress, even in terms of women's labor force participation. The third factor that I'd like to talk about is gender-based violence. The threat of gender-based violence has always been in our society. Even pre-COVID, 1 in 3 women were actually subject to physical or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. But the threat today is the fact that we are inured to these statistics. These numbers, the news of women being subject to violence doesn't shock us as a society any longer. And that's the biggest threat. The fact that there was a shadow pandemic accompanying the COVID-19 pandemic was not something that was unexpected to anyone. But our tolerance to this violence, our acceptance of this violence is a threat to women's progress, because we're not taking as strong a stand against it as we should be. And sexual harassment against women on streets, in public places, this deters them from taking up jobs. There are studies which have proven that women would give up job or education opportunities if they have to travel more and risk the threat of violence en route. The fourth factor and the fourth threat that I'd like to talk about today is climate change. And today I'm wearing green because I think it was the color of Women's Day this year, because even this year, UN Women recognized that women stand to disproportionately be impacted by climate change. And this is already happening. If we look at statistics from the UN, 80% of climate refugees that have occurred in the last 3 to 4 years have been women. But the bigger channels of impact are actually coming in on women's time poverty and on women's livelihoods. Women are disproportionately dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. We know for a fact that in countries like India, 70 to 80% of rural women who actually work in the agricultural sector, do labor-intensive work. Noted. So this vicious cycle of vulnerability comes up because of climate change, and also because women have to collect water, and this increases their time poverty if water conservation becomes a challenge. So in the end, I'd just like to end with one quote from Minouche Shafik, that we need a new social contract fit for the 21st century, where society is no longer sustaining itself on the backs of women's unpaid labor. And we need this now, because I am not willing to wait 136 years for gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitali. I think that you've put an exclamation point certainly on those critical issues that we will now continue to elaborate on. So I will pivot now to our esteemed panel and briefly introduce Miss Julian Rosen. My German is not good enough. Berschichtsleiterin Internationales, Head of Division for International Affairs, and also with the National Council of German Women's Organizations and a representative of the W7. Julian, would you share with us from your perspective and the important work you're doing bridging the gap between the G20 and the G7 on these issues on 2 minutes, very quickly, on what you see are the critical issues?
Thank you very much, Margo, for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I just can say that everything Mitali just stressed is actually our motivation to just come up with concrete recommendations. And I just wanted to highlight that, yes, the World Economic Forum mentioned that it takes actually 1 generation more just due to this 1 year. But if you take a closer look at the economic gender gap, it's even more critical. It's 268 years, 268 years, yes, to close the economic gender gap. And I think this is where we all need to work together, because it's not just about the half of the world's population, as you said in the beginning, Margo, at the end, it's about all of us. And this is the reason why back in 2014, the G20 already agreed on, so quite sure whether you heard about it, but it's about closing the gender gap in labor participation by 25% until the year 2025. So some time has passed, some improvements have been made, but as we can see, due to the pandemic, but not just to the pandemic, we need to really increase our efforts to really just see some good outcomes. And I'd just like to remind you, yeah, the pandemic made us realize the importance of care work, and seeing that, we heard, it did hit women and girls the most. And we're really talking about the she sessions because they are losing jobs way more often than men. But there are underlying discriminations. As you just mentioned, Mitali, we really have to address, otherwise gender equality won't be possible. And yeah, I think we talked about it in another talk, Margo. We need to see that women's equality and gender equality is not just a human rights issue. It really is an economic no-brainer, as Christine Lagarde put it in one of her speeches. And we need to realize this. And yeah, so we are, for the W7 are working on concrete recommendations. Later on, if I have more time, I'd like to introduce some of those recommendations. And of course, we're working very closely with the W7, which is the Women's Dialogue for the G7, to just bridge the gap, as you said, coming from the G7 to the G20, with a lot of power and a lot of opportunities for political opinions forming, and then hopefully we will bridge the gap even further to include all the UN nations. So this is just for the beginning.
Thank you very much, Juliane. And I'm going to be trying to manage the time. I'd now like to pivot to Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi. Mavis is the Executive Vice President of the African Center for Economic Transformation. And we've heard a little bit about the Indian perspective. Africa is the world's youngest continent. It's going to be a major factor in any recovery efforts. And I'd like to ask Mavis if you can share with us, given the work you're doing on the economic transformation, what it means from your perspective and what are the issues as you see them?
Thank you, Margo, and thank you for the invitation also. I'd like to begin by saying I fully agree with Mitali. You could almost take Asia and replace it with Africa when we look across the issues that she raised as critical. As she was speaking, I'd write a topic and then she would repeat it and I'd scrub it off. So the 4 areas she wrote about income inequality, the digital divide, gender-based violence, climate, and unpaid domestic labor are issues that were problematic pre-COVID. During COVID, the inequity on the continent was really made prominent. So we saw, for example, that 80% of respondents to an African Development Bank survey, 80% of female respondents said that they had to temporarily shut down their businesses. 41% of them talked about reduced hours. 64% of female-led businesses stopped operating, compared to 53% of men-led businesses in a country like Cote d'Ivoire. We also saw that women took the burden of increased domestic care. So be it for children at home or be it for the elderly, suddenly we saw an additional burden on women. The fundamental thing, though, is to use Ghana as an example. We knew, for example, within the second week of lockdown, most of women's businesses had started to recover. Women had started to look for innovative ways to recover from the initial shock of businesses closing down. So, and we saw that, for example, in Ghana, we saw women, employed women in the informal sector recovered by 16 percentage points, whereas within that same period, men employed in the informal sector saw a dip. So women also have a resilience to rebound back better. I suppose for us, the fundamental question is, we know all this, we keep repeating the data. It's not a human right, it's an economic right, a human right, everything. We don't have a dearth of policy recommendations. Why are they not being implemented? Why are, everywhere you look on the continent, we have extensive policy recommendations, from placing a gender lens on macroeconomic, gender-based budgeting. We have it all, but we keep talking about examples. So for us, it's not about economies building back better. They were not good enough. It's about building forward better. And in building forward better, how do we go to our toolkit of policies and ensure they are being implemented? And we are really driving a process. And very quickly, in asset, we don't say women hold up 50% of the sky. We actually say women hold up the heavy 50% of the sky. So they need more support for the world to keep going. That's it from me, Margo.
Thank you so much, Mavis. I'm going to turn to Ms. Renani Javala, the Indian National Coordinator of the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, and a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Because I know, Renani, your perspective really is focused on women at the base of the pyramid. Talk about holding up the rest of the pyramid. Renana, would you kindly share your perspectives on the issues?
Thank you so much, Margo. And I'm really grateful to be invited to this because I know that the voices of women at the base of the pyramid is very rarely heard. I'd like to just focus on women and work and their economic contribution. As you know, about 60% of women, or 60% of all workers in the world are in the informal economy. And about 50% of those people are self-employed or have micro businesses. Most of them, of course, and I think it's close to 70%, are in agriculture. And these are the women who are holding up a lot of our economy, but are not either recognized or are helped or have any resources to better themselves. Let me first say not recognized. Let me give you an example. In Africa, I have seen, and in India and other parts of South Asia, women work on their own small farms, but they are not recognized as farmers and are not counted as farmers. When women's economic participation is measured, women like those who work on their own farms or who produce things in their homes or even domestic workers are often not counted. And so the low rate that is given to us is actually misleading because a lot of this work is not even counted, although it should be counted by the definition. Secondly, what these women need as women and as workers is two things. One is resilience. They need to have instruments of resilience, which I'll go into later, and they need growth. They need growth in productivity, they need growth in income, and for that, they need all kinds of inputs, especially financial inputs, but also markets, and also different types of skills. And that is what is deprived to them because they're not even counted as workers. So when we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit about, oh yes, and I should say that a lot of them have sort of moved backwards due to COVID, especially the micro businesses who had to use up all their capital, and those women who had very few skills and can now not come back into the workforce. And so when we think about what to do next, we must think about building up both their resilience and their economic capacity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renana. And now I'm going to turn to Simona Scarpaleggia, former co-chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment and global CEO of Edge Strategy, to share with us the private sector perspective on things. Over to you, Simona.
Thank you very much, Margo, and thanks for the invite. Well, a lot of the data have been shared by those who have spoken before me. What I can say from the private sector perspective is that also in this domain, the pandemic crisis has has had a widespread impact, and data show that the economic consequences of this crisis have been felt more by women than by men. 3 out of 4 jobs were held by women, and independently from that, they were laid off or they quit spontaneously because they couldn't bear with the burden of dealing with family chores and with their job. It is complex now to start and change the pace, change the direction and change the pace. But especially now at this stage, it is clear, as it has been said, that we need a new social contract, that we need to capitalize upon the awareness that has been shared also today in this panel, that the inequality is there and it's heavy, and it is time also for everyone to do their parts. Governments, international organizations, NGOs, and the private sector can and must do their part to put the women's economic empowerment at the heart of their strategies and at the heart of their programs. And definitely this is not the time to give in on SDG 5. In fact, it is the time to act and dramatically accelerate the pace of SDG 5. And the key to this is to hold organizations, be them governments, public, private, accountable for what they do and for their declarations. What we have to do is to enhance a more cooperative approach. I think we need to abandon definitely the win-lose approach, but have more a win-win approach. Cooperation and care will be pivotal. Is to definitely close the pay gap once and for all, and it is to close the digital divide. And this will be a great opportunity. All this should be supported by supported and monitored by a systematic measurement to secure and enhance this accountability. So later on, maybe I will be able to elaborate more on these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona. And actually, Simona, by taking the approach and focusing on the solutions and what needs to be done, you've allowed us to transition into that part of the discussion. And as the timekeeper, I am already feeling the pressure on this. I'd like to invite our participants, if you have any comments or questions, to put them into the chat. We're not going to have enough time to get into those, but the nice thing about this conference, this summit, and the platform it offers is space for us to continue the discussion beyond this session. So I really would like to engage you or reach out to me through the summit, and I will ensure that we keep this discussion going. So I would now like to turn to Justine Greening, Right Honorable Justine Greening, founder of Social Mobility Pledge and Purpose Goals, former Secretary of State for Education, and a pivotal actor in her role as Secretary of State for International Development in the development and support of the UN High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment. To again, continue this pivot as we build momentum. It's really about the solutions. We've heard it. We're all clear about the fundamental issues. Where do we put our energies? Who needs to do what? I think Simona's already given us a lead on that. Justine, from your perspective now, working within the UK in your new role, where do you see the priorities? What needs to be done?
Thanks very much, Margo, and it's great to see everyone today, and I thoroughly agree with everything that people have been saying. And I think the biggest challenge we have is to really make sure we pick up the momentum. As Simona just said, we need to really, I think, have a greater pace perhaps than we've been able to have over the past 2 years, and we all understand the challenges of COVID. But as Mitali said, in many respects, this has taken us backwards, and it demonstrates how fragile some of those gains can be on equality, and particular gender equality. And actually, we should also reflect on the fact that we face some fresh economic headwinds now on cost of living, on inflation, and they will affect all countries very differently. But I think we can also expect that women will be on the front line of the impact of those global economic challenges that we now also particularly face. I think in terms of the solutions, first of all, it's worth saying that Goal 5, which the UK campaigned for alongside so many others, was about gender equality. It wasn't about things being a bit better for women. It was something much more fundamental. It was about a 50-50 planet. And so we should recognize that perhaps some of the steps that we took to move things in the right direction, we need to do more of that, but it may be that we need to do different things if we're really going to move beyond that initial progress that we'd seen pre-COVID to substantially get to a more equal gender equality world. I think in terms of some of the areas we can look at, Margo, you asked, I think women's voices matter hugely. She's not on the panel, but Helen has done some amazing work, Helen Pankhurst, particularly here in the UK, on really bringing and amplifying women's voices in our parliament. Governments have a key role to play, and we shouldn't forget that. I think governments also have a role to play on education and on making sure that they set a legal framework for our employers to be able to take the steps they need to really empower women economically. I think for employers, there's a real issue on transparency and data, and I think measurement matters, and perhaps we can have a longer discussion on that. And then I think finally, there's a broader societal issue about our expectations and about how men and women deal with one another and gender-based violence. As Mitali was also saying, these are issues that need far more attention and far more work. And I think we should reflect on the fact that governments can pass laws, but ultimately people need to take those laws on board and follow them. Otherwise, change doesn't really happen. I'll close my comments there, Margo, because I know you need to get to lots of other people. But thank you again for having me on the panel.
And thank you for joining us, Justine. I really, really do appreciate it. Now I'm going to ask each person on the panel who hasn't spoken as yet, or to come back around in your second round, to identify in 2 minutes your priority solutions and the actions that need to be taken. So I'm going to pivot back to Juliane, given what you're recommending for the G7 as well, and over to you, Juliane.
Thank you very much. Mavis, I liked what you said. We don't want to build back better, we want to build forward. And actually, we're not here to fix a broken system, we really want to fundamentally change it. So we're talking about transformation, but still the things we are asking for, I think, Justine, you just said it, I just want to build up on that. We need presentation, mainstreaming, gender budgeting, resources, and disaggregated data. Why? Once again, we need to ensure women's and girls' full and meaningful leadership and decision-making processes. You heard all of this before, but I just need to underline it. We can't come up with good solutions if they are not on the table. And we need to mainstream. We need to apply gender equality as a cross-cutting principle in domestic and foreign policies to overcome traditional and patriarchal, my God, this word, we don't like it, and I can't even pronounce it, patriarchal power dynamics. And we need to use recognized tools such as gender impact assessment, all of this gender checks, flaws on gender equality market systems. And of course, gender budgeting is one of these. We need to implement gender equality responsive budgeting to make the gendered impacts of budgets and expenditures visible, including unpaid care work, and increase financial resources dedicated to feminist associations and non-governmental organizations and activists. And last but not least, we need data, because just what we see and track, we just can come up with better solutions. So these are my general remarks. And looking at you, Margo, may I come back with 2 concrete remarks later, or shall I just quickly introduce?
No, just go for it, because we're under the gun, please.
Okay, so everybody's talking about the just transition, talking about green deals, focusing on the climate crisis and trying to have a gendered approach to it. At least we need to. And the W7, sorry, definitely ask for including the care work as one in this green framework, because otherwise we just get lost again and again and again. We are not including it in the GDP, but now focusing on this transition, just label it as green, and it will help us so much, because we're going to forward a lot of money again in this field. So not again losing the care approach, and starting with putting 2% of the GDP concretely in the investment for care infrastructure. This will help us enormously. So we need concrete numbers. I just suggest to start with this 2%, and the outcomes will be intense. Thank you much for this.
Thank you, Juliane. I'm now going to pivot back to Mavis. Again, like I said, Africa, the continent of sub-Saharan Africa will be critical. And where do you see the priority actions and solutions, Mavis, please? Oops.
Hi, Margo, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Sorry, my power just went off back again. For ASSET, the priority areas of focus at the moment are, one, ensuring that we are supporting and encouraging governments to focus on gender-based macroeconomic policies and gender-based budgeting. And just simply because until we put gender at the heart of those two critical parts of the economic agenda, we are skirting around the issues. And I always get into trouble for saying having a women and children's ministry doesn't mean you've ticked a gender box, because often they don't have a voice, they are poorly resourced, they understand the issues, but nobody listens to them. So we need to put gender equity at the heart of where the money sits, macroeconomic and gender. The second one is, fully agree with Julian, data. If you can't measure it, it's easy to forget. So there's really a lot of work for us to do on data. And then the third area is accountability. We talk a lot, but we don't actually have robust mechanisms for naming and faming and naming and shaming. We really need to strengthen our accountability mechanisms on the continent. So the AU said 2020 to 2030 is the decade of economic inclusion for women and financial inclusion for women. Let's track it. Let's have some clear indicators of what economic inclusion actually means, and let's track it and measure it and show where we're making progress and shame where we are failing to make progress. So those would be the three issues I think we need to focus on going forward, Margo.
Thank you very much, Mavis. Renana, can I ask from your perspective, particularly for women at the base of the pyramid, what would be your three priority solutions and therefore action steps that are required? I don't know if we...
Yes, I was muted. Thank you. And the three things I'd like to talk about. Firstly, and I'm very glad Justine brought this up, is voice. When policymakers or the market or employers can't hear or don't want to hear what is being said then the solutions never come. So the first thing is these women who are working, not recognized, not getting assets, they need a voice, a place where they can talk about their issues and have those issues heard. And just as a very small example, SEVA, the organization which I'm representing, has for many, many years worked with street vendors. A lot of women in both the African and Asian continents run their micro businesses as street vendors. But there is no forum, and continuously harassed by the municipalities and police. But there is no forum where they can either negotiate or even bring their grievances. And those are the kind of forums that need to be created so that their voices are. So the first thing is voice. The second thing is resilience. And as women, we know that the world still expects women to do a lot of the household work and also to work. And in order to do this, of course, what we really believe is that household work should be shared equally. But whether equal or not, childcare, access to water and sanitation, those are points which really help resilience of women workers. And so resilience is a very important area. And the third area is how do they increase their productivity growth? And here I'd especially like to talk about young women, young girls who are now getting education which they never did before. I think in the last 20 years worldwide, girls are being educated, but they don't have a bridge into the workforce, because education and in the workforce are, there's a big gap. And that's a very important gap that we need to fill through skill training, and non-governmental organizations especially are very important there. Second, finance. And although microcredit is available, it's very rarely available for micro businesses. It's available for consumption, very small amounts, but micro businesses are starved, and especially women's micro businesses are starved of finance. And finally, skills, skill and technology. I'm glad the digital divide, because
Okay, I think we're losing you a bit, Renana.
Smartphone.
Renana, we're losing you. But I think we've gotten the essence of what you were saying.
Do you get me now?
Yes, but yes, but
so I'll wind up then.
okay.
And so what I was saying, a smartphone for every woman. And finally, I repeat, voice, voice, and more voice.
Thank you for that, Renana. And voice in and of itself must be accompanied by agency, the ability to act, which is what I think we're all talking about. I'd like to pivot to Simona. You started with solutions, but from the private sector, there's a lot of talk about, pay equity, efforts that have been taken by different countries to address it, but we're not seeing the kind of shift that we need. What, in your view, needs to be done?
Yes, well, the private sector really can play a very important role here. If we think that, the International Monetary Fund has evaluated that over 60% of the global GDP in many countries is in the hands of the private sector, that the private sector has widespread integrated supply chains, then of course they are able to influence. And equal pay, you're right, is one of the areas that can be tackled. It is, on paper, it is a matter of compliance, because more and more countries are requesting to be transparent and to show that there is equal pay, and yet we're not there yet at all. And the point is that the private sector has to not consider it just as a matter of compliance, but as a matter of growth and development. And it has to require proper resource allocation. And I would say the factors that influence pay equity have to be tackled, such as the fact that leadership positions are not sufficiently covered by women in the organization, that women tend to spend more time out of the job market to to attend their family responsibilities, that women have a lot of additional unpaid jobs, especially in terms of care, that there is a segregation in terms of education of boys and girls that start at a very early stage in the school system, and that there is an actual pay discrimination. So this is identified by multiple studies. So this can be systematically tackled, hence leading to a compliance to the requirements. And the requirements most probably have to be a little bit more stringent, because it's a comply or explain, and then you have given 4 to 5 years to go to the next round of verification. So it is really something that can be more stringent. But another thing that I would like to address, and that has been touched before, is really this digital divide. We have a unique opportunity now to close this divide, because for the simple reason that everyone has to be upskilled or reskilled, men and women. Is one of the unique opportunities to say, okay, now we start from scratch. We all start more or less from scratch, so we can even the ground and give women this possibility.
Thank you, Simona. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. In the interest of time, and I really want to acknowledge the comments that are coming from our participants. And so I really want to ask that we continue the discussion through the discussion space. Mitali, you identified 4 specific threats, and they have continued to be themes throughout the discussion. In 2 minutes, Mitali, can you tell us what should be the priority area of focus given the 4 issues that you have identified?
Thank you, Margo, for giving me the opportunity for this closing words. Very quickly, I think a lot of the comments that have come in and from the questions and the other speakers have focused on how governments need to take a lead on gender equality through instruments like gender responsive budgeting. And while there's no denying that governments have a huge responsibility, I feel like at this point, we really need corporations, and the private sector to lead the charge on creating ecosystems for women to come back and work. I completely agree with Juliane when she says 2% of GDP on care work, but also 2% of corporate earnings on care work. It's extremely important that we now start looking at the responsibility of employers towards creating workforce systems. And then the other thing is around gender neutral parental leaves. In most European countries, you see this, but in the global South, maternity leaves are the norm. And we need to move away from this mindset that a child is the responsibility, or child caring is the responsibility of a woman. It's actually the responsibility of both the people that created the child, and that could be people of any gender. So I think we need to have a complete structural shift in thinking if we have to respond to the aspirations of young women and girls, where we're talking about new systems, new social contracts, and the gig economy, and supporting women who participate in the gig economy as well.
Thank you very much, Mitali. And as usual, you've helped us to center this. I want to go a step further because it's easy for us. And yes, we're making these recommendations for the G7 leaders, for the G20 leaders, the corporate sector, and our various governments. But I think we need to personalize this. So I have a challenge for everybody. How can you as individuals, through your networks, through your institutions, actually work to effect change, even if it's changing your personal perspective or relating to a specific action that you can take starting now, a discussion with the person next to you. I want to challenge you, because if we want the greater change, it has to start with the individual and move across all of the structures. The second point that I heard here today is this is an opportunity to start afresh. This is not fixing what is broken, because it's for many people, it's beyond repair. We have an opportunity. Let's take it and move with it. That's the charge. And we need to move away from the tick box, check box. Gender mainstreaming in 2018 was something that I led the charge on. And now we see that it's become an excuse for not including a gender-specific approach, particularly within the G20. I'm seeing it right before my eyes. So I really, really want to express my appreciation for what we've heard here. I'm looking forward. Please do reach out to me. I'm going to put my email, because I would like for us as a group, the 50 people who've been on this call, to continue this discussion. I want to thank Global Solutions Summit, and I applaud you all for the effort and the investment you've made in this 50-minute session. Thank you very much.